Hi, Lisa.
That is my wife of 23.
Yeah.
Yeah, 23 years.
Yep.
Yeah.
You better get it right, Sean.
I know.
Are we rolling?
Yeah, we're rolling.
We're rolling.
What was it? Oh, let's not do that again. We just did that last time.
I know.
Oh, so anyway.
Boom,
Yeah.
2, 3,
Yeah,
4.
I get the point. So, yeah, this is Two Next podcast episode
First beat
14.
on the last
I get
bar
the
of the
point.
intro. Shut up. Will you let me play?
Well, come up with new plays. Anyway, I'm one of your co-hosts. I'm Sean.
And I'm Lisa.
One thing we got to correct right away. I'm surprised nobody called us out on this before because between the time that we recorded the last episode and the time we actually released it, something happened that made part of our podcast incorrect.
By the way, this is the Two Next podcast, in case you didn't know.
Yeah. Didn't I say that?
No, you
Episode
didn't.
14?
No, you didn't.
Oh, okay. Yeah, in case you can't read the description of what you downloaded. But anywho, we said that next time we talk to you, we'd have the Sail on Sailor new release. No. It turned out they delayed that till December 2nd.
Because it's the way things go when you're a Beach Boys fan. You have to get used to releases being delayed and pushed back and contested and all kinds of things.
Yep. Feel Flows was delayed. Smile Sessions was delayed. Pet Sounds Sessions was delayed 18 months.
That was hard. That was really hard.
Wow. But is there anything else that we need to catch up with before we get into today's main thingy?
I don't know.
Neither do I. I don't think so. But hey, we're running a little bit longer than we usually do this episode. How do I know that? This is just the beginning. Magic.
Ooh.
For those of you who either didn't bother reading the episode description or forgot what the episode description was, we have a special guest. It is our second guest that we had in this podcast, and the two of them have this in common. They're both book authors.
That's right.
And who is this book author? Well, hold on to your seats and you will find out.
Ooh.
So our guest today is a professor at UCLA's Herb Alpert School of Music. He is known for documentaries such as The U.S. vs. John Lennon and Beautiful Dreamer, the author of Kiss, Behind the Mask, and of course, you probably know him best as the baby goat on Brian Wilson Presents Smile. So I am very thrilled that we were able to get David Leaf to join us for this. David, welcome to Virtual Chicago.
It's exciting. I've always wanted to hear Tunex, and finally I'm getting to be on Tunex.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you. Thank you for joining us. Oh, by the way, David Leaf, in case you didn't know, also has a new book out. It is called God Only Knows, The Story of Brian Wilson, The Beach Boys, and The California Myth. It's only available on Amazon right now, right? At least in the U.S.
That's right. There are a couple of bookstores that have it, but good luck finding a bookstore and one that actually has it in stock. Amazon is the place to get it for at least 2 or 3 more weeks, I think.
And of course, we will keep a link to that in our show notes. Probably everybody's asked you this before, but was there anything that you could not include, let's say in any of the 3 versions of the books, simply because there wasn't space or there wasn't time?
There's lots of things that I didn't include in any edition of the book, including the new one, which is pretty gigantic, something like 465 pages. And the dividing line for me was, is this relevant to Brian's artistry? Is this something we need to know that will help us understand who this man is who became Brian Wilson, one of the greatest artists of his time? And so it wasn't a space issue so much as it was a kind of a dividing line in the sand that I didn't want to cross.
And there's so many different directions you can go in with that, because when you're talking about Brian's artistry, it's not just his songwriting, his producing, his musicianship, the way he worked in the studio, but also just Brian himself, that everything about him goes into the work. I mean, it's been said that if you want to really know Brian's story, you got to listen to the music, because that's where it's really all in there. And that's so true. There's so many different dimensions to him that you have to really look at the full picture.
I think that's right. What matters about Brian, he's told us repeatedly in his music, endlessly, a decade after decade, he tells us whether he's in his room or he's busy doing nothing or he's a cork on the ocean. He's made it very, very clear what's going on in his emotional sense. And I think that comes down to why I think Brian is so important, besides the obvious reason that he made all these great records. But I think he's the first person for whom feeling was paramount in the music. What feeling do I want to express in this song? Before there was a lyric, he talked about sitting at the piano and playing what he called feels, just trying to get a vibe. And to this day, I don't think there's anything different about his process. His collaborators through the years some have been there for a year, some have been there for a lifetime, but they all were in service to what it was he wanted to say.
Oh, absolutely. And what really, as a fan, kind of ramped up my appreciation and my understanding of this was when I started listening to things like Stack of Tracks and the backing tracks on the Pet Sounds box set, because it's like, okay, there's more here than what I always knew from the songs. Like, there's more story underneath. Like, for instance, with I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, when you listen to just the track only, which may have been recorded before they even had the lyrics set, there's all this melancholy in the song, but then in the chorus, there's a piano part that's actually a little whimsical. And it's like, yeah, that's so Brian, that it's like, it's not all just, I'm sad, I don't fit in. Like, he has that sense of humor as well that plays into his work that is, it's so important. And that was such a revelation for me. I mean, I heard that, 25 years ago, and it still sticks with me.
You know, it's what you're saying is both true and something that the casual Beach Boy fan wouldn't know about. Even big Beach Boys fans don't spend the time to listen the way you're talking. When At My Piano came out last year, I remember, okay, I'm going to play it. And I thought it was going to be Brian at the piano singing those songs. So the first listen through was like, isn't he going to sing? Aren't there going to be vocals? Because certainly his voice and the harmonies is what attracted me 60 years ago. But the second time I listened to it, I realized what a beautiful statement it was. That it was, okay, here are the songs that I think really matter, and I'm going to play them for you as if this was church on Sunday and I'm Bach. And this is this week's hymn.
And thinking about that, it's just really interesting that he included the Mount Vernon and Fairway theme as part of the what was important enough to put on that album.
You know, one of the reasons I use the song title God Only Knows for the book is that very often the answer to the question, why did this happen or why did Brian do that, is God only knows.
Yeah.
I didn't ask him why he did that. It's kind of, you know, he's not an artist who I push for detail. When I talk to him, and I haven't interviewed him all that many times, it's more when the occasion arose that I needed to interview him, like for the 88 press kit or for the Beautiful Dreamer documentary. Most of the time, we're just hanging out. So I don't know why he did it, but I remember vividly playing the bonus disc in Holland and being both charmed, frustrated, and crazy angry that it hadn't, you know, it was like, these are incredible pieces of music. Why didn't you do more with them? Of course, I didn't understand anything about anything at that time, but it's a nod. You know, you mentioned, Lisa, his sense of whimsy. If we were to talk about the three things that matter the most to Brian, it would be music, food, and laughter. And I think food is now eclipsed and is number one. But one of the things that makes these records that he's been writing, arranging, producing, sometimes not producing, but still making all these years is like there's just no telling what he's going to do. And his ability to change on a dime is, I think, what makes them endlessly listenable.
Well, also, I think he has just such a vault of music in his head that there can be something that was recorded. I mean, 1974 was almost, or 19, well, actually, would have been 50 years ago, almost 50 years ago that Mount Vernon and Fairway was recorded. And he may not have thought about it, talked about it, played it in all these years, but just on that particular day, it popped up and he brought it out of the vault. And it's just like how we've seen different songs that he's recorded that recall things that we know were put down back in 1962, 1965, that he pulls it out again for things like That Lucky Old Sun or No Peer Pressure, bits and pieces, or even finished songs that we know were done many years ago. They suddenly come up again.
That's his artistry. Music is really, he said to me once in an interview, I'm much deeper than people understand. And how can one argue that? I mean, here he is at 80, having survived this this roller coaster of a life, and had incredible success, incredibly horrible periods that he refers to as being in prison, and had a personal redemption and a creative renaissance. And somebody should do a book of just Brian interviews, put them all together.
That would be fun.
He's not necessarily the most reliable narrator of his own life.
Right.
But when it comes to him talking about music, he's very, very consistent.
Well, it's also interesting, too, when reading or seeing different interviews and kind of what the interviewer gets out of him, I think, is reliant on how well they know Brian and can make him comfortable and put him in a space where he will talk about his music.
Absolutely.
Or other things, as opposed to asking him the same questions he's been asked 68,000 times, or expecting him to just be like anybody else, be like Mick Jagger or Paul McCartney or anybody else who, like, you kind of have to work in a different way. And that's why I laughed with Long Promised Road, because what did they do? They sat him down in a restaurant. Like, that was a way to make Brian very comfortable, take him to a place he really likes and have some good food and put him in a space where he felt very comfortable and safe.
I think you're right. You really see it best in the Don Was film, I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. One of the things about Brian, because for a long time, people who were going to interview him or do a story, they would ask me, so what tips can you give me about interviewing Brian? And I said, just don't ask him a yes or no question.
Yep.
Because I'd say, you ask Pete Townsend a yes or no question, and he'll say yes or no, and then he'll explain his answer for 15 minutes. Brian, he's been asked the same question so many times, and I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. Very simply. So what happened with you and the Beach Boys? Well, they wanted to make their kind of music, and I wanted to make my kind of music. Well, how much more of an explanation do we need?
Yeah.
Where do these songs come from? Well, every once in a while, your soul wants to come out and play. We'd love him to elaborate, but why? He's saying it so clearly. Lisa, you mentioned him being asked the same questions over and over and over again. When I was building up to asking him the question for Beautiful Dreamer, so why did you stop working on Smile? When I asked him the question, he answered it, and it felt to me like he gave me the answer. He said, look, if I tell you, can I never have to be asked this question for the rest of my life? And so he says, okay, I'll tell you from my heart. There are 4 reasons. And he gives the 4 reasons. And okay, people, you want to write a book about what happened to Smile? Go ahead. But he's pretty clear on what he thought and expressed to me in 2004.
Yeah, I remember watching that when we watched that the first time when Brian flat out said, well, Mike didn't like it. I was like, whoa! Because in the fan community, there had been so much discussion and speculation. And
there still is.
Oh, there still is, of course. But it's just that he came right out and said it. I was like, man.
Well, when Carl is asked about Smile in the Don Was film, he says, I liked it, but, Mike thought the lyrics were, he says, airy-fairy and unrelatable or something like that. What would have been the dream scenario in December of 1966 was for the Beach Boys to say, you know what, we're going to sing on these songs, but you should probably call this a Brian Wilson album because there's no way this, and then you do that, and then we'll come back, and then we'll make a Beach Boys album.
It should have been a side project, and then Brian could have taken it to Monterey and had some. This is just my little dream scenario that if he could have taken it to Monterey and had like some, if not all, the Beach Boys as the singers, and then the Wrecking Crew members as like the Brian Wilson Orchestra or something, and that probably would have been a smash. Because it would have been presented as Brian and not the Beach Boys. Well, that's just my little thing.
I like that dream. I'm going to adopt that one. The other reality is that he had already made a solo album. It just had the Beach Boys name on it called Pet Sounds.
True.
And so I think there was legitimate concern, like what's going on here in terms of the Beach Boys' future. However, I remember reading an interview with John Lennon where he said, I think around the time of Revolver, or Sgt. Pepper, aren't you concerned you're going to lose some of your fans? And he says, yeah, but we'll make some new fans.
Yep, absolutely.
And so that's what artists do. And the Beach Boys is, and always has been a family business.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The name of the business is Brother.
Which would have been fine if the three brothers were there.
Well, yeah, right.
Oh, who was it in Beautiful Dreamer because we just watched it not too long ago again for the first time in a while. Who was it who kind of talked about like band members who were too scared or nervous to really go? It
was Sir George Martin, I think.
Was it?
I think
yes.
It was.
Yeah, it was Sir George. And, one of the things that's not in this edition of the book that when I started doing interviews, this has been great because we're talking about stuff that no one's asked me about. But somebody asked me a question about the Beatles and the Beach Boys. And I said, maybe the simplest thing to say is that in 1962, Brian Epstein became the Beatles manager. And in 1962, Murray Wilson became the Beach Boys manager. And you had a guy who was determined to keep it a family business versus this bright, urbane, sophisticated, educated man who had a world vision for what the Beatles could be. And took them. He was never scared. He didn't go to the recording studio and go, fellows, this might be a little bit too much for the fans.
Syncopated. Sorry, I couldn't resist.
Yes, the famous Help Me Murray tape, which, I wish I had heard that when I wrote the first edition of the book.
Oh yeah. Man.
But I didn't. I just refer to it in this edition. And I don't know if you guys got the reader's guide I put together for this book.
No.
I'm going to be honest, I'd never heard of the reader's guide.
Send me an email and I'll send it to you. And
yes.
You can post it. What I did, as I realized as I was throughout the book, it's like I'm referring to all these things. Check out this article in the LA Times, watch this speech. And so I decided, well, I'm going to make things easy for the reader. I'm going to make a guide that will have the links to all that stuff.
Oh, great.
I have a young woman who's helping me with a lot of stuff, and she helped me do it. And I think it's invaluable in making the book an audio visual experience as well as a reading one.
Yeah. And that's something that you didn't have in 1978 or 1985.
Nope.
But it's interesting that you put Murray and Brian Epstein side by side in their differences. But Derek Taylor wrote how Brian Epstein would set himself on fire for the Beatles And I think at least in those first couple of years, Murray would have done the same. I mean, when it's kind of amazing when you realize in such a short period of time, Murray got them signed to Capitol freaking Records, this unknown band of young boys playing a genre of music that was not nationally popular, really, or hadn't really developed to the point of being nationally popular. And I mean, that's pretty remarkable.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that, about the Love and Mercy film that I felt was unfair is we're seeing the bad side of Murray, but we're not seeing, hey, he bought Brian a reel-to-reel tape recorder. The music was central to family life.
Oh, yeah.
In a 45-second montage, if we had seen Carl and Brian and Audrey and Murray around the piano singing, and then the three boys singing in their bedroom, and then Brian in his room listening to the freshmen and on the tape recorder, we would have gotten a sense that Murray recognized Brian's talent. However, by 65, I think he would have set the Beach Boys on fire.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, well, yeah, in a different way.
And when he sold the publishing, which I don't even know if he had the legal right to sell it, but when he sold it, talk about the ultimate smack in the head to Brian, like, your songs are no longer going to be worth anything, so I'm going to get what I can and get out of you. And yet, in the same time, Brian writes Breakaway with him. I mean, it's so incomprehensible.
It's all very, very complicated. If you're going to delve into the story of this band, you have to keep the word complicated at the front of your mind at all times, because again, we've been in fan forums for many, many, many years and seen people who expect Brian and the Beach Boys to act like their families or normal people. And it's like, no, it's just not. There's so much more in there. And again, when you're dealing with family dynamics, there are just so many things that no one can ever understand, really, unless you're in it.
Well, yeah, it's to expect. Look, they weren't a normal family long before they were the Beach Boys. Reading the Tom Nolan story in Rolling Stone in 1971 about Murray taking his false eye out and making them stare into his empty eye socket, that's pretty far outside the norm.
Yeah.
And what that did to the three of them, how do you quantify that? Well, you can't. How do you expect them to act normally after that? Well, you can't.
Yeah.
But they are a family, an extraordinarily dysfunctional one. To me, the saddest thing is that all of them put the Beach Boys ahead of their own lives. I'm talking about the brothers.
Oh, yeah.
Mike, I think, has found a way a long time ago to have a life outside the Beach Boys.
Yeah, really. Probably getting into TM may have saved him, because in reading his book, it felt like that was the beginning of a turning point for him, where he had that whole interest outside of the band. And then I think it also kind of set his head straight in terms of learning more about the business and being better at managing the work so that they could continue.
I don't know. It's the stories of Mike and Carl, the endless battles over what songs were going to be played on stage, the stories of Mike and Dennis fighting backstage. I think he just, this is a guy who loves life and loves wives and has enjoyed his life, and good for him.
Yeah.
He's kept the Beach Boys going all these years. The current band, by all accounts, is terrific. And if you want to see the Beach Boys, you can see the Beach Boys. Like all what they call legacy acts in the business, they're out there playing their hits. I wish it had been more like the Rolling Stones, where they toured once every 5 years.
Yeah.
And then it would be special. But the way Mike has run it is the way he's run it. That's really none of my business. My focus, from the very first, the first sentence in the book, I think, is this is the story of Brian Wilson.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is what has made me a target on some of the fan forums. Like, why don't you talk more about the other Beach Boys? And, I addressed that, I think, a little bit in the author's note in this new edition. But ultimately, I'm going to go with Sir Paul McCartney and Sir Elton John and Sir Barry Gibb and Sir George Martin and Bob Dylan and all these other people who point to Brian as the reason to discuss the Beach Boys music.
Well, you can't talk about the Beach Boys music without, Brian. It wouldn't have happened if it weren't for Brian.
Yeah, and we fall into that trap too, because we're talking about, okay, what do we talk about next episode? And I'm thinking, man, we've been talking way too much about Brian, but then you realize it's almost impossible not to.
Well, we've been talking about Brian for 24 years.
Yeah, that's true.
As long as we've actually, even before that, before we even got together when we were on the Usenet forum. So we've been talking about Brian for a really long time, and we're not done yet.
No,
there's, just talking to you today, Lisa, I heard things that I haven't heard anybody say before. So there's lots of what ifs. One can look at the last 60 years and focus on the negative. In this update, I really chose to focus on what we can celebrate about what's happened since the last edition of the book came out. So I don't mention lawsuits. I don't dwell on deaths. I don't dwell on business problems, lack of sales, bad record reviews, or bad records. It's just kind of not what I'm interested in. I just followed the same path that began with me as an outsider and as a journalist and ended with me becoming a friend and an insider and being by Brian's side for some pretty cool things. And, I've said this before, I know one can go to Wikipedia, anything to do with Brian or any of the Beach Boys, and there's a long list of information about it. There's no point in my putting that in a book.
Yeah, right.
And so the goal of this update was, okay, I'm going to tell the readers stories they can't get anywhere else. And Sean, you were asking me about length issues, and the update kept getting longer and longer and longer. When the contract was signed, it was for an update of up to 30,000 words. And as I got to about 1994, I wrote to my editor and say, I'm going to need 40. And he wrote back, okay. And as I got to 1999, I wrote and said, I'm going to need 45, okay. And as I got to 2004, it's like, I'm going to need 50, and then I'm going to need 60. And then at 60, he finally said, okay.
But isn't that such a blessing, though, that you're saying, I'm going to celebrate Brian, I'm going to focus on the good stuff? Look at all the good stuff that has happened since 1985. It's just amazing. Yes. Where in 1985, we never could have predicted most, if not all of it. And look at all that's happened. It's remarkable. And I don't write it as a joke in the update, but I mentioned that, Brian should be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist. That's going to be someone else's cause to take up. But he's worthy of it. He's certainly worthy of it as a producer. Absolutely. Those things don't matter to him. They don't mean anything to him. Mm-hmm. They only mean things to people like you and I, to fans. We're all just fans. And it's hard to even talk about it with strangers because they're angry about one thing or another. And it's like, you want to be angry? You should have been around when Landy was there.
Oh.
And Brian survived it. He didn't only survived it, but he met Melinda. At Landy's insistence, Brian started dating Melinda. And so they were like a teenage couple. And suddenly he started writing great songs for that first solo album that were like, he was like a teenager. Oh. So in the midst of genuine madness, he put out what I still consider to be his best solo album. And if Landy hadn't been there, Brian probably would have died in 1982 or 83. If Landy hadn't been there, there would have been no solo career. It was Landy who insisted, for his own reasons, that there be a solo career. So it was a nightmare, certainly for nobody more than Brian.
Of course.
But what do we want to dwell on? I had to write a chapter about those years. I had to talk a little bit about it and give the reader insight into what Brian was going through. But he came out on the other side. And the 90s and the 2000s up through the Beach Boys reunion, I think was just a series of triumphs for him. That was an amazing period. Yeah. I know we've talked about this in a previous episode, but that first show at the Beacon Theater, June 18th, 1999,
a bunch of us got together for dinner beforehand, and we were all just saying, is this really like, are we actually going to a Brian Wilson show? Like, we were like just beside ourselves.
And at the same time, we were also saying, okay, well, if he freaks out and doesn't want to do the show, that's okay.
Yeah, like, we'll forgive him. We love him.
By the time he reached the Beacon Theater, he was, I'll put it in quotation marks. You can't, your listeners can't see. He was a touring veteran. The first dates in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Minneapolis, et cetera, those were the dates where, like, what the heck is going to happen? And by the time we get to Wisconsin, he's ad-libbing on Wisconsin. He just, I think he had been told, nobody cares about you unless you're in the Beach Boys. That's where people will care about you. So he was quite stunned to see the response of the audience to just Brian Wilson playing his music. The same response he had when he did Brian Wilson Presents Smile for the first time. The same response when he came out at the Radio City Music Hall tribute. With each show in 1999 and 2000, 2001, the Pet Sounds Tour, playing for the Queen. I mean, all of these things contributed to his comfort level. He never became a great performer.
Sure.
He's not a ham. He's not a, hey, everybody, welcome to the show. He's not that kind of a guy.
Hey, what did Brian himself say? He said, I'm no Robert Goulet.
But we could see over the course of, say, from 1999 to, or even 98, when I know he did a few TV appearances to promote Imagination. And I think he was on Letterman, where he really looked very uneasy, but he still went out there, still did it. But you could tell he wasn't 100% comfortable, but just between there and Smile, his comfort level definitely grew and developed. And I'm sure there was a lot going on with his band and other people to make sure he was in a good space.
He just needs to be surrounded by love. Nothing more than that. It's like he said in an interview, I need emotional security. I have emotional security. I think Live at the Roxy may be the best of Brian as a performer, if you will. Just, it was a small space. He was relaxed. There was a lot of friends and family in the audience. I think that's him at his most comfortable.
Well, that's like when we saw him at BB King's in, was that November or December of...
It was November. It was my parents' wedding anniversary weekend. It was November 2000.
Yeah, and I mean, that was a small venue, and Carney was there. She was at the next table over from us, so she was right where, he could see her, and I mean, he was great at that show. Especially for Caroline No, he got so into listening to Paul Mertens doing his little sax solo that he forgot to come in, and he laughed. I mean,
so, well, let's wait for it to come around again. Almost Arlo Guthrie-ish, I guess.
And then he nails the final note, and Carney just started sobbing. Oh man, that was beautiful.
Yeah, it's for people like Carney who really lived through and suffered on a personal, dramatic level. I mean, what she say in one interview, we're going to spend Father's Day with him for the first time.
Well, that was in I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. Yeah. It's
stunning to realize what these people have all been through. He comes out of it, what he said it repeatedly in interviews. My last name is Wilson. I guess I have a lot of willpower. Nobody expected him to make 80, 70, 60, or 50.
Yeah.
There's a number of times where it was like, he'll be dead soon.
I mean, seriously, it just makes me think, you, David Leaf, 1978, you have this new Brian Wilson Beach Boys book out. Someone tells you, you're going to document him finishing Smile in 20-some years. You're going to be godfather to a daughter of his that hasn't been born yet. What does 1978 David Leaf say to that?
You left out being an usher at his second wedding.
Oh, yeah.
What does David Leaf say to that? Well, cut the crap. That ain't going to happen. That's what New York David Leaf would say about it. But in 71, when I fell in love with Till I Die and Surf's Up and became obsessed with his story and felt that something wasn't right. And my roommate said to me, then do something about it. And I said, okay, I'm going to move to California and write a book about Brian and become his friend and help him finish Smile. Did I believe it? No, it would be like your high school friend saying, I'm going to be class president and one day I'll be president of the United States. That's how absurd a notion it was. Did I believe it was possible? The things that you asked me, Sean, none of them seemed possible. And, when we sat and talked in 93 about putting Smile music on the Good Vibrations box set, that was surrealistic enough. Okay, we're going to get some Smile music officially released with Brian's blessing. That felt pretty darn good. I didn't think there was going to be anything after that. I certainly never expected him to tour. While I always dreamed of producing a tribute show to him, having worked in television and worked on several tribute shows, I never thought he would be on stage singing Heroes and Villains, or the boys' choir would be singing Our Prayer, or Vince Gill and Jimmy Webb and David Crosby would be singing Surf's Up. I was thinking of a symphonic tribute show. But everything happened, and I use this comparison. When we were kids, we used to line up dominoes, and then we'd push one domino and they would all go over. And there's a lot of dominoes in this story.
Going back to the 1993 box set, I know that part of the logic of putting the Smile material on there was, well, we have Good Vibrations, we have Heroes and Villains, but there's a huge gap in between. How exactly did Brian actually agree to dig into the Smile archive and allow the world to hear all that, when usually you couldn't mention that to him without him, I don't know, saying, we're done talking?
Yeah, he would say it's inappropriate, or whatever he would, because I didn't present it to him as finishing Smile. I said, this is a document of your 30 years of your career, and to leave that 6 or 8 month gap there would be a giant hole. And it's a matter of treating him with respect. It's his music. Mm-hmm. I didn't say, here's what we're going to do. I said, Brian, I want to talk to you about something that I have an idea about. And when I presented it to him, it was logical from my point of view, and he thought about it. It was logical from his point of view. And then he was like, okay, which songs should we include? And I purposely didn't mention Fire. I also remember somewhere in the 90s, and I can't tell you when, at the kitchen table, I had a bunch of 3x5 index cards that I had written all of the titles that we knew of from Smile, and he and I trying to sequence it. You talk about surreal. It's all surreal. There's a great picture in the first tour book, I think, in 99, the one you would have bought at the Beacon, because we didn't do a tour book for the first 4 shows because it was like, who knew what was going to happen? But it's a picture of the theater marquee in Ann Arbor, an evening with Brian Wilson. And I get goosebumps just remembering my New York friend, one of Brian's best friends in the world, Ray Lawler, us walking around the corner and turned the wrong way, and there's the theater in the middle of a blizzard. It was just, what? How could that be? So the Beacon Theater was especially a great show, though, because in America, New York is his biggest fan town. And it's like, him in London, there's he is idolized in New York and London in a way that he isn't elsewhere.
That's interesting, because I remember at the TNT tribute when Chaz Palminteri talked about how when he was a kid growing up in New York, it wasn't cool to admit that you were a Beach Boys fan. How about you as a kid in New York? I mean, did you find, like, the Trade Winds song says, New York is a lonely town? I mean...
Well, I wasn't cool, so it wasn't a problem. I was a top 40 kid, and Chaz must be a few years younger than I am, because in the 60s, the Beach Boys were all over top 40 radio, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67. In My Room, I think, was one of my first favorites. I loved all the big hits, of course, but When I Grow Up to Be a Man was a favorite. I went to see them in concert in the fall of 67, and I was on the bowling team. how much less cool could it be than to be on the bowling team? So I went with my friends from the bowling team who had seen the Beach Boys the previous year at the same venue. And I didn't know their names. I didn't know who was on the stage. I couldn't believe they sounded great, but the show was short. I mean, the fact that we could walk up to the box office the night of the show and buy tickets is indicative of that they were entering a period where they were not popular in New York. And that lasted a long time. That lasted until my dear friend Chip Racklin and his friend Mike Kleffner put on the Beach Boys at
Carnegie Hall.
At Carnegie Hall. The prelude to that had been when they had joined the Grateful Dead not too long before that. But the idea of cool, I wasn't part of my equation. I didn't know there were magazines you could buy and read about music. So the first issue I bought of Rolling Stone magazine was the one with the Beach Boys on the cover. And I bought it because, the Beach Boys are on the cover. I'd be interested to see what that's all about. That's how uncool I was when it came to music. When I went to college, the dormitory was like a massive Spotify playlist. You would go from room to room and everybody had a cardboard box and you would flick through their albums and you go, what is this? And they'd look at you like you were an idiot. You've never heard of the Moody Blues or whomever, Led Zeppelin, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and you would play the album and you would fall in love repeatedly. And, oh my God, I've got to hear this album. I got to go buy it and I'm going to listen to it 10 times in a row and 9 times the next day and 8 times. And you would, it was like injecting them into your bloodstream. So with what Chaz said at Radio City, it wasn't cool to be a Beach Boys fan circa 67 to 72. They were playing colleges and not necessarily filling the auditoriums. People could be yelling at them because, they weren't playing the hits and Mike might be yelling back at them. But I saw them in the fall of 71 and it was a revelation. I wasn't cool enough to have seen them the tour just before that, but I saw them on the Surf's Up tour.
I have to wonder, though, in terms of the perception of coolness. I mean, my father grew up in a tough town north of Boston, and he was in the Navy in the early 60s. And my dad was very, very into cars, and later on refinished a Corvette Stingray beautifully. And when he was home from the Navy in 64, he heard, "I want to hold your hand and I get around." And he had no use for "I want to hold your hand," but "I get around." It's like they're singing about cars. And he heard Little Deuce Coupe and Shut Down, and that really spoke to him. So it's like, I wonder if it's also, if he would have been as interested in the Beach Boys if he had heard them, because I don't know if he cared as much for, at least in the beginning. I think he eventually liked all of their stuff, but the music about the cars and the girls, that's what really drew him in. And I think it may have been just fortunate that that's what he first happened to hear, and that's what got him in the door to enjoy the Beach Boys. I don't know.
Well, I think you're right. And obviously in 66, that completely turned. If your first Beach Boys listen was God Only Knows, you might have thought, what the heck is that? Or Caroline No. But we'll blame Capitol Records for what they did. But that period, circa 63 to 66 is all anybody cares about in the vast majority of Beach Boy fandom. When we talk about people like us who are hardcore fans, who are obsessive, we're talking about people who know that Susie Cincinnati was a B-side. I mean, it's like, it's nerd knowledge that isn't really relevant to anybody outside of our world. And then people can argue, I love Giggins, but he's doing a petition to get Still Surfing or Still Cruising reissue.
Oh yeah.
And it's like
Still Cruising in Summer and Paradise. Yeah.
And it's like, God bless you, Giggins. But those aren't. I don't need those to be reissued.
Yeah.
Nor do I need to hear the '85 album again. Or
yeah, I remember how your comments about male ego, for example. You were not shy about that.
Oh, my.
It's funny. When I started work on the book, as I wrote in the update, I had to read the book. And in the course of writing the new material and then editing and proofreading and going through it, I probably read the old book 7 or 8 times. It's intense. It's dense. And yet there's entire books of material that aren't in there. So I don't know. I hope people are reading it and finding the path I took to be a worthwhile path. I can say the update, to hype it a little bit, is more than half the length of the original book from 78. So, I'd said to the publisher, we have to make sure our audience are the people who bought it the first and the second time. We have to make sure to give them something that would make them buy it again. And yet there's tons of stuff that aren't in this book. People have said, how come you didn't write about, no peer pressure? And it's like, I'm not writing record reviews. I'm telling a story. I didn't go to the 50th anniversary tour, and I explained why in the book because of what was going on in my life. Mm-hmm. So there are things that this book isn't. Mark Lewison is writing these amazing books about the Beatles. He's in hopefully going to finish volume 2 very soon.
Oh, we're hoping.
Yes, and it's like Robert Caro wrote a 3-part biography of Lyndon Johnson that's definitive. And Lewison's book will be definitive because by the time anyone else decides to write another book on the Beatles, everyone's going to be dead. Yeah. I hope that somebody feels, if it's necessary, to take all of the literature and everything and write some great book about Brian and the Beach Boys that I'd want to read. That's quite a challenge because right now, having done what I've just done, I don't want to read anything. Yeah. It feels like, no, just listen to the record. Put on the Surfer Girl album. Put on Sunflower, whatever.
All you need to know about Brian is in the music. You're talking about how there are books of material not in there, and that's literally true because I remember reading Becoming the Beach Boys by Jim Murphy, and I'm thinking, oh, here's something I didn't know before. Here's something I didn't know before. And then when I reread your book, I said, oh, that's in the Jim Murphy book. And the thing is, what Jim Murphy does is he fills in all the gory details in between.
Well, Jim did mammoth work.
Yeah.
Just like the book on Pet Sounds. It's like, okay, I felt like I said as much as I needed to say about Pet Sounds between my book and the Pet Sounds sessions and the Pet Sounds CD. But Dominic Priori's Dumb Angel, the Gazette, where he collected all the articles that had been written about Smile to that moment. Mm-hmm. That was a spectacular piece of work. But does it change? Does any of this change the narrative of the story that I told? And I hope not. I hope that I got it right. But what I really believe that I did is tell a story about what Brian and I did together, which I know is true because it's from my point of view of here's what he and I did and here's what happened. And all the gory details, if someone else wants to write a book about the Landy years, go right ahead.
Steve McParlin, The Wilson Project.
Well, and I knew Gary Usher back then, and I think Stephen did wonderful work. I remember getting those calls from Gary Usher that is alluded to in the Usher Project, and it was like, oh my God, this is horrible. It was really horrible, and I certainly don't get into all the details about what the Attorney General of California did and all of the legal actions. But ultimately, what mattered was that, led by Melinda, Landy was gone.
Kind of backtracking a little bit about how you're writing about what you and Brian did. And that's really how I think all 3 versions of the book come across. But something that I noticed, like from, say, 1985 to 2022, there's a huge, I don't know if it's so much a difference or evolution in how you wrote, but it almost becomes that new part becomes, this is the story of David Leaf, but it's all about Brian too. And you get like really emotionally personal at some points. Like I remember particularly being touched about how you talk about your close relationship with Daria And I mean, you get really, really personal. Was that kind of a conscious choice, or is that just your natural evolution of your writing style over the years?
I think it's the only story I had to tell that I thought was valuable for the reader. A friend of mine in England, great old friend, when he was in the middle of the update, we were exchanging emails, and he said, I feel like I'm reading your diary. And I said, is that good or bad? He said, I'll let you know when I get to the end. But I think that intimacy is what gives it value, because otherwise I'd be another journalist writing about what happened the last 40 years. What I had to do was give it all context. I had to talk about what was going on in my life to understand how it related to what was going on with Brian. There's one story I don't think is in there. I was hired, or maybe it is. I was hired on a Monday with another person to write and produce a big CBS television special. We got our contracts on Tuesday. On Wednesday, the president of the network who had been involved in hiring us was fired. On Thursday, the job was canceled. But in the industry, there's a phrase called pay or play. If you make a deal, you get paid. The show gets canceled. On Friday, I got the check and a phone call from Brian saying, I need you to do something with me in the next couple of months that I could not have done had that show not been canceled. Now, how do those things happen? I mean, that the money I got from the show is what paid the bills during the time I was doing whatever that project was with Brian, and I don't remember what it was. If I went through everything I have in storage, I could figure it out. But on top of everything else, Sean, to go to my writing style here, the deal for the update of the book was made a year and a week ago, or sometime around this time, November. I said to the publisher, I would love the book to come out for Brian's 80th birthday because he's supposed to be on tour in England then. In fact, he's playing in England on his birthday, and I'll come over and we can promote the book. And they said, oh, that'd be great. They said, however, our U.S. company, they can't move as quickly as we can. They'll put it out in the fall. Is that okay? I said, yeah, that's okay. And then he said, however, for us to have it out in June of 2022, you need to turn in the manuscript by January 1st of 2022.
Oh.
So I had less than 2 months to write what I did.
Wow.
So there's a certain, I think, to answer your question, a certain stream of consciousness to it. Now, over the course of January, February, March, and April of this year, I was constantly editing, rewriting, proofreading, fixing things, making things better. But essentially, it's what I turned in January. I remember the publisher's copywriter read it and said, this is kind of he used a German word, a Bildungsroman. It's a literature term, like it's a coming of age story. And I think that's it is. I have been criticized for talking too much about myself in the book. I didn't know how to do it without doing that. And I also, there's a sense that he's that Brian Wilson guy. Well, I was Brian's friend and I loved working on a lot of stuff with him, but it's not how I made my living. I had my writing career and then I had my television producing career. There were these three things happening simultaneously. And every now and again, there would be this great intersection, like the All-Star tribute to Brian Wilson or Beautiful Dreamer. But for the most part, Melinda would say, hey, we're getting ready to do a new tour book. You want to write an essay? And it was like, sure, that'd be fine. I mean, just as I was finishing up this book, I got a call, we're doing a new tour book. Do you want to write an essay for it? Okay. It's like, there's something about writing about Brian that you were talking about your father, Lisa, being into cars. It's like, I go from, I don't know, it's like, instead of it being a 4-horsepower engine, it becomes an 8-horsepower engine. It's just, Brian inspires me like nothing else.
And that's really what makes your contribution to things like the tour programs, the, your books, the liner notes, things like that, so great, because those of us out here in the seats, in the fan community, we know you're a fan too. So it's like, even though you're in the inner circle, you still have the fan perspective. I mean,
you're one of us.
You could say the same about Darian and the other guys in the band. It's like there's a great level of comfort knowing that things are being taken care of by people who are kind of like us, like that you get it.
Well, yeah, Darian's a great example. I mean, when I met him 30 years ago, I didn't know he had read my book in high school. Well, if he was the only person who ever read it, it would have been worth writing. Because without Darian, there's no Brian Wilson Presents Smile.
Oh.
There's no Pet Sounds tour. I mean, all the things that happened because the Wonderments came into being and became Brian's band. So it's an unbelievable circle of fans. And I think that's why Darian and Probin and God bless Nick and the people in Brian's band who come from the fan world like we do are so gracious when they meet another fan. It's like we are all the same people. We've just traveled different roads.
Oh, yeah. Like that long conversation we had with Probin after House of Blues here.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, these are good people. I mean, Probin is a really good person. Darian is just, these are in my old world we would say they're mentions.
Yep.
I mean, they're just good folks, and their devotion to Brian exceeds anything that was imaginable.
Kind of going totally in a different direction here. Well, maybe not totally. A favorite thing that people like to talk about with your books, particularly the second edition, is that story you tell about how Dennis called you up in the wee hours in the morning once, demanding to know your source.
Yes.
Are you at liberty to say what he had a problem with?
If I remembered, okay. I'd be happy to tell you.
Because the source was Audrey, right?
It was Audrey, and it was probably something about how Dennis wasn't in the group or something like that, and they had a force. I'd have to read those chapters to see what the quote was. It wasn't. I don't know that it was all that significant. It was just funny. And Dennis is. I hope somebody makes a great film about Dennis.
They were supposed to.
His artistry, is obviously second to Brian, but really significant. He had the same ability to sit at the piano and put his feelings into music. And he was like, they would say, well, be careful, a live wire. I mean, it's like he just had so much energy. And sadly, he didn't have the discipline that would have allowed him to have a long life and a long career. You listened on the web to, what do they call it? The cocaine tapes from the early 80s. Great music was being made. It was fueled by self-destruction.
Yeah, I mean, I know we've heard that they were planning on getting him to Landy in 1984. And of course, he passed just before that. But you have to wonder if Landy would have been able to do anything to save him, or if Landy would have ended up looking like he just walked out of an explosion with his hair singed and kind of staggering with his clothes torn.
Brian's a survivor. Whatever situation or circumstance you put Brian in, he's going to survive. And a lot of it has to do with the fact there have been all these guardian angels in his life. Mm-hmm. I mean, I have that story about Linda Ronstadt in the book.
Yes, yeah. Yes.
Jerry Schilling and Carl and Dennis. Marilyn, goodness gracious, she endured a lot. Mm-hmm. It was not easy.
Yeah, we imagine she probably had a long talk with Melinda before they got married. Now, here's what you need to know.
Well, Melinda probably already knew a lot by then.
That's true.
No, I mean, I give Marilyn props just because she was dealing with all this stuff when she was still a kid herself.
Yeah, I would just wonder why you would get married, why Daddy would let you get married at 16. But Priscilla married Elvis.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And Annie Hinchy was still in school when she married Carl.
Yeah, Annie came from a really well-educated, sophisticated family. She's a sweetheart. She's also a mensch.
That's the impression I get from what people, because I never really heard much about Annie herself, but nowadays people are starting to talk a lot about her. It's like, man, she sounds like a really great person to know.
Well, also the Carl issue of Endless Summer Quarterly, she contributed a lot to that.
Yeah.
Because I didn't even know that she had been the circumstances around when they got married, and she told that whole story and gave pictures and everything.
Yeah, it's when as I write in the update, when I wrote the original book, I knew nothing about the music business. I knew nothing about writing songs, how to start a band. I knew zero or next to zero. I had a good friend who was a songwriter and had a publishing deal, and I went to a few of his sessions, but beyond that, nothing. And here we are, 37 years or 35 years since I wrote that, 45 years since I wrote the book. And that book I didn't have a very long time to write either. Well less than a year. I think I wrote it in 6 months, maybe. I'm a workaholic, and I was obsessed and still am obsessed by the subject. But, I didn't get to talk to all the people I always wanted to. Some of them I got to talk to, like Annie, I got to talk to for Beautiful Dreamer, who, I didn't know back in the day. The book was not necessarily well received by the Beach Boys world.
This time, really going off topic here. Before we actually started this, we were making small talk about weather and all this, and telling you how over here in Chicago it's in the 20s, which is unusual for November. This is actually something Lisa wanted to know. What did Brian really think about his life in St. Charles, Illinois, when he had his second home out there?
Yeah, not so much, not the part about like working with Joe Thomas, because we've already, a lot's been said about that, but just more. And I know, Brian, of course, had experienced winter weather and snow, but I mean, going from Southern California to living in
it just goes back to what I said a little while ago. He is a survivor. Put him in whatever circumstance you put him in, he's going to figure out how to survive and be comfortable, as comfortable as possible in that circumstance.
So he didn't hate being out in the prairie in the winter in the snow.
I don't think he spent too much time outdoors.
Smart.
Well, he had
man.
a recording studio in that house. Why would he ever need to leave?
True. But yeah, because especially when you're here in the city, the lake gives a little bit of protection. So it's always a little bit warmer in the city. But when you're out, St. Charles is quite a distance outside the
30
city.
miles inland.
So it's like you got nothing, no big buildings to block the wind and all of that. So I always wondered that if Brian really hated it, or if he liked the change, or so he just adapted, huh?
Adaptive is a good word.
Interesting. That is not what I expected, but okay.
Yeah. Lisa, think about all the things he's been through in his life, starting with his father.
He's been through worse than St. Charles.
True. Yeah, Chicago winter is nothing to him. Interesting.
For all these years, you've been writing about Brian, the Beach Boys. You've been friends with Brian and all this. And it's probably maddening seeing these fan assumptions and myths going around that just won't die. And is there anything that people are still kind of believing out there, these myths and everything, that you wish would just stop?
The only thing that crosses my path on a regular basis has to do with the idea that the first book was about Brian Wilson and the other guys. I hear that from certain quarters, and I'm a bit baffled by that. As I wrote in the author's note, the title didn't help, but once you start reading the book, it's pretty clear what the book is about.
Yeah, your first sentence says it all.
What happens on a tour, and I, a few years after I wrote the original book, I went on tour with Kiss, of all people, for a few days. And I just saw it. It's not interesting. I mean, it's car, hotel, car, sound check, car, hotel, car, airport. I mean, there's not a lot to say. It's not what I wanted to write about. I mean, the stories that I heard about the road, to my mind, they were both irrelevant and unprintable.
So I remember reading in the new edition of the book how you were in the Dakota. I gotta ask, did you actually get to play the Imagine piano?
Oh no, I did not.
Oh.
I did not play. One would have to be Elton John, I think, to play the Imagine piano. First of all, I'm not good enough piano player to even dare to ask. But no, that would seem sacrilegious.
Something we got to know. We've been to LA a couple of times, and we really do want to go back because we're having good times there. What's your favorite place to eat? Where do you like to go?
We like to collect restaurant recommendations from people.
Yeah.
Well, asking restaurant recommendations has to do with budget.
Right.
Because Los Angeles, like all big cities, has incredible restaurants that are incredibly expensive. So the question is, where do you go where it's not crazy expensive? And good luck.
Yeah, we understand.
Many years ago, we used to love going to a place called Gladstone's on Pacific Coast Highway because you were right on the ocean in Malibu. There's a great row of restaurants on Ocean Avenue in Santa Monica, including one called Ivy at the Shore. When somebody invites me and says they're on an expense account, I like going there. But I'm not the right person to ask about restaurants. My fiance is a really good cook, so we're eating home.
We'll go to Cantor's.
There you go.
We went there. We checked that place out. Oh man, was that good?
No.
Really? If you got something better than Cantor's, oh my God, we are.
Well, if you go to Langer's would be the best downtown deli. There's a place called Philippe's. The French dip sandwich is amazing.
I always like a good French dip.
An old favorite is the Pantry, which is also in downtown. That is open 24 hours. There's always a line, but it's great. LA isn't really a great deli town.
Coming from a New Yorker, I would assume that would be the case, right?
It's not a great pizza town.
No.
We don't trust pizza in California.
No.
Well, we don't trust pizza west of the Delaware River Gap, so.
Yeah, I mean, it took me a while to kind of accept some Chicago pizza, but yeah, it's still nothing like what you get in the New York area.
Actually, the best place for pizza is in New Haven.
Yes.
Amazing places.
Totally agree. Well, there is a place here in Chicago that does New Haven pizza. It's called Peace, and one of the owners is
Rick Nielsen.
Yeah, from Cheap Trick. That place is amazing.
It is really good. All right, now, a couple of years ago, if I'm understanding correctly, there was a screening somewhere of that very first Smile concert from February 20th, 2004.
Correct. In the fall of 2019, we had an event at UCLA to honor the first recipient of the Brian Wilson Scholarship.
That's a good reason to do it.
Nice.
I had established that fund, and so we invited the donors and Brian Wilson family and friends to come to Schoenberg Music Hall. Ironic that it's actually the auditorium across the hall from mine where I teach. I thought it was ironic to be playing Smile in Schoenberg, given the kind of music that he wrote. But what we did was we screened the low resolution, unmixed version of Brian Wilson Presents Smile from opening night at Royal Festival Hall. It's the only time it's been seen outside of the editing room.
Is there any chance it'll get a more wider release someday?
I hope so. Why don't you start a petition for that?
Yeah,
I'll get together with Giggins.
Yeah, I would. I'm hopeful that for the 20th anniversary, it'll see the light.
See if there's more shots of Darian looking like he's gonna.
Yeah, Darian did not look well.
He looked like during the whole Mrs. O'Leary's cow, he looked sick to his stomach, and for good reason.
Yeah, I mentioned that to him once when we were lucky enough to talk to him, and he said, I felt that way the whole show, believe me.
Yeah, that had to be.
Well, the show was an extremely tense event.
Oh, yeah.
as I instructed one of my cameramen before the show, I had my cameraman and I said, okay, I want you to go somewhere up high so we can see the Brian on the stage, but not looking small. I want one of you behind Brian shooting out at the audience so we can see the audience reaction. And I said to Jim, who was my number one guy, I said, I want you to follow him up the steps.
Oh,
that was a hell of a shot.
That was amazing. Yeah, in the book, I think you said it was like a, dead man walking or something.
That's exactly what I said to him. I said, and because we didn't know, is he going to go up those steps?
And the shot of him sitting backstage and Melinda's voiceover saying like how I'm about to present my greatest work and I'm scared to death. Like that had an impact on me, just watching that and remembering back how we felt waiting to hear the news from London. Like, how did the show go? What did they do? Was Mrs. O'Leary's cow a fire or a candle? There was a lot of anticipation and tension among the fan community all over the world, I think, that night.
One of my favorite scenes in the film is the montage of people talking about where they came from.
Yep.
To see Smile, because this was our obsession, but it was a worldwide obsession. And there was somebody from Tokyo. And I mean, there were people from all over.
That's like the one big Brian thing.
Well, they did the right
missed.
thing by doing it in London, though.
Oh, yeah.
That crowd at Royal Festival Hall, they eat him up.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, it was the right place. It was at the right time. And, there are many moments that I love about that night, not the least of which is that it happened. But one of my favorite moments is after they're finished and Brian is trying to get the crowd to be quiet. Hold it. And the crowd just gets louder. Mm-hmm. And he steps back and he lets out this sigh.
Yep.
And it's like, okay, I've let Smile out into the world and the world hasn't come to an end.
Yep.
And I just love that. He accepted it because we accepted it.
It wasn't inappropriate.
No,
it sure wasn't.
Yeah, and I still remember just being there at Radio City Music Hall. Here we go with Heroes and Villains, and it was a delayed reaction. I thought, that's an odd one to start with. And then, wait, what?
As I like to say, I have said this before when we talked about this in a previous episode. I mean, Sean was wearing a black cashmere sweater, and I would say, I just ripped his sleeve clean off. I was so stunned.
Well, not literally.
I know but it was like, you think like in a cartoon or something. I mean,
yeah, there was a lot of Tex Avery expressions going on.
I love that song so much. I mean, I still remember being in the Beacon in 1999 thinking, okay, this is the only time we're ever going to see Brian in concert. He's never going to do this again. And there's a whole bunch of songs we're never going to hear him perform because it's too close to Smile. And it was just,
I'm so glad we were wrong.
As the tours went on and different things happened, it's like, okay, we heard this. And then when he did Heroes and Villains, I was like, okay, we've moved up another level here.
Yeah, I think that night was the turning point towards Brian Wilson Presents Smile. Mm-hmm. Because with Our Prayer, Heroes and Villains, Good Vibrations, and Surf's Up,
yep,
they not only went down a storm, as the expression would go, but they started to become part of his set going forward.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, also just him hearing, I mean, with Surf's Up, I mean, it's in the broadcast. I mean, we were there, but in the broadcast, it's like, I love how they finish singing and it's not like the audience starts applauding and cheering like for many other songs before they're even done. There's like a moment of silence and that it's like we all had to come back to life because we're like, oh my God, we are hearing this performed and it was performed amazingly. Everybody was in that whole venue was just captivated by it. And you don't really have that moment of hang time before an audience just bursts into cheering and applause. Oh, that was such a moment.
You don't need me to be on TuneX. You've got better stories than I do.
Like, hey, well, we're lucky that we've been able to be there.
Yeah,
we've
been
some
so
big
freaking
moments.
lucky. The only thing that I feel bad about is that the world did not get to hear Jubilant Sykes do that amazing rendition of That's Not Me.
That's Not Me, yeah.
And I don't think he ever recorded it on his own. What are the chances that someday we'll actually get to see those songs that they left out of the broadcast in the DVD?
Slim. The challenge with everything in my business is money. The cost of licensing the footage, licensing the songs, and putting it out. Somebody's going to say, okay, this is going to cost X. How much are we going to get for it? And so, maybe for the 25th anniversary, we'll get it back out there. But the show isn't even out there. So, it's not just Jubilant Sykes. The whole Pet Sounds performance isn't out there.
Yeah.
It's certainly frustrating, but then again, it speaks to why you went the night you went. You had a one-time only experience that was worth the cost of admission, I would say.
Yeah, 4 hours.
Yeah, but I want another time.
4 hours, I think, because I don't think we got out of there until like close to midnight.
Thank goodness, because I think after midnight, the unions went into golden time. It would have been a disaster. That's the most expensive project I've ever worked on.
Really? I think that was really all we had to
Well, I just have one more question, and I'm a little, if this is... This is a Brian question. I should have asked this after the Imagine piano, because it kind of goes with this. And if this is too venturing into something too personal about Brian, please, no offense.
It's too personal.
All right. Yep. Sorry.
Something I've always wondered. I know I've heard that, like in hotel rooms, Brian often has a piano available, and I was just wondering, like on a daily basis, does Brian play the piano every day? Does he sit down at it and just play feels? Does he play a favorite song? I always just kind of wondered, like, what when he's at home, when he's not rehearsing, not recording, not actively composing, does he just noodle around on the piano just for his own enjoyment?
That's a really good question. I can only speak to the times when I was around. Mm-hmm. When I was around, the piano was like Linus's security blanket for him. That's the place where he felt most comfortable.
One thing I wanted to follow up on is you mentioned how the new version of California Myth, that it's big. And it's like you said, it's like 450 pages. Something that I think we should have mentioned in our previous episode that we might have wanted to mention, just kind of as a side note, we're also big fans of the Monkees. And Andrew Sandoval just came out with an updated version of his definitive Monkees book. And when it arrived, it was like, holy...
It's huge.
It's not something you can curl up with. It's massive. And we literally have it lined up with our box sets because it's not shelvable. This is not the case with your book. Your book is like, I can hold it in one hand and I can open it and read it one-handed. So if anybody hasn't gotten this book, number one, get the book. Number two, don't be put off if you are like us and that you got a behemoth Andrew Sandoval book and you're worried about the size of this new book. It is absolutely dealable. It's manageable. You can put it in your carry-on in the...
Thank you, Sean. I think it's also readable, especially the update. Oh, that's absurd.
Yeah. Yeah, here, just so you can have it. Yeah, the world cannot see this because this is an audio podcast, but David can see what I have in my hands. The Andrew Sandoval book compared to the David Leaf book.
It's like the Manhattan phone book or the Sears catalog or something.
Oh, the Sears catalog is much smaller than this.
It's quite remarkable considering the length of the Monkees' career.
Yeah.
Not at the risk of repeating myself. The old original book is in this new edition.
Yes.
1985 update is in there, and I bookended it with the material that essentially is book length all by itself. There are lots of surprises, dozens and dozens of things that you've never heard before.
Yes.
That nobody has ever read before. So it's not just two books in one, but it's like this new book is like, I know. That happened. She did this. I mean, those Linda Ronstadt stories are spectacular.
Mm-hmm. And it's like I said in the previous episode, how the 78 edition and the 85 add-ons, I spent maybe 3 or 4 days reading those. When I got to the new part, I did not put the book down till I was done. I read it through in one sitting. It was just that fascinating, that grabbing, and kind of editorializing a little bit here. And I think a good part of it is that I did not become a Beach Boys fan until about 1989, 1990. Previous editions of your book came before that, like a few years outside of that. Now I'm actually relating to all this. This is what happened during my fandom, as it were. So I think that was a big appeal for me, is that I could relate to it. I could say, yes, I remember that. I remember that. Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of the same but different in that my fandom goes back pretty much to when I was a toddler. But I didn't really have a lot of, I didn't have access to really any Beach Boys books except for the one by Byron Price, because that was in our town library. When I started getting into reading about the Beach Boys, I mean, you couldn't get anything in the bookstore in the mall. So I had that book, and then Heroes and Villains by Stephen Gaines came out, and I got that. I think I was in 9th grade. And I'm like, oh, more stories about the Beach Boys music and the stuff I wanted to know. And you open it up and it's about, it starts with Dennis Wilson waking up in a dumpster in Venice Beach. And it's yeah, this is not I read it, but it's this was not the book I was expecting. And I really didn't, it wasn't until the 90s when I had more access, and especially once I started going to more used bookstores and started finding a lot of the literature that was out there, and then more books started being published.
I was told by somebody that my book was one of the most stolen library books of all time.
Yeah, that was in demand. I remember that time when we could not find your book anywhere. That was the same time you couldn't find any Beach Boys albums from Sunflower through the 85
you
album.
could find David Leaf's books, but they were $500 on eBay. But we were lucky. We got very lucky.
We got lucky. It was 10, 15.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we paid $15 for the 1978 book and $10 for the 85 book.
Yeah.
We hit it lucky.
Almost list price, but you were at the Beacon show that I talk about in the book where the young fan came up to me. Oh, Mr. Leaf, I just got a copy of your book on eBay for $500. And, I wasn't thinking. Instead of saying thank you, I said, oh, I'm sorry. And it was
he wasn't kidding, because that was when people were finding it, it was for outrageous prices because it was so hard to find. And that's about the time eBay and things like that were just really coming up.
I wish I had a couple of cartons of them back in the day.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, seriously.
It was great talking with you guys.
Yeah.
You guys really know your stuff.
Well, we read your book. That's why we know our stuff.
No. It's got nothing to do with reading my book. You know your stuff because you listen and you read and you go to important shows and you pay attention and you're thinking about it from the point of view of a serious fan. So it was a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, likewise.
Great. Thank you.
Using your own words, you've been quite a mensch to spend time with us, and I certainly appreciate it. And I'm sure I'm speaking for Elise.
Yeah, definitely.
We appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
My pleasure. You take care. Happy to come back to your studio anytime.
Great.
All right.
Thank you,
Take
sir.
care.
Take care.
And so that was our little convo with David Leaf.
Pretty awesome convo.
It was intense.
Much more than we expected. So,
Yeah.
David, thank you for taking the time to talk with us. And we even continued the conversation a bit after we stopped recording. It was a great experience.
Yeah, it really was. I mean, that's something about us fans, is that we just can't shut up.
No, yeah, you get a couple Beach Boys fans or Brian Wilson fans in a room, and the conversation goes on for a long time, just because I think it's not as much that there's just a lot. Well, there is a lot to talk about. There always is when it comes to fan theories and current releases, recent releases, stuff that came out years ago. And there's always things to talk about, but I think it's just also just that joy that still comes with finding people who understand, who speak your language.
Who would imagine that David Leaf, of all people, would be one of those people? Good grief.
But it's always great to talk to fans and people who have great knowledge and great love and great appreciation. And, well, especially for somebody like David Leaf, who just getting involved with the music of Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys literally changed the course of his life. That just opportunities just kept unfolding, both related to Brian and the band and also in other areas, that his work led to other projects and other opportunities and other experiences. So,
and just plain being a close friend of Brian's. I guess remember when we asked David, hey, think about 1978 you know, think about all this that has happened. You documented Smile. You were Brian's daughter's godfather, and of course, usher at Brian's second wedding.
Yeah.
But
I mean, It's just, you never know what can happen when you set out to have, even if it seems like a crazy ambition or crazy goal at the time. I mean, you got to try, because you never know, you might hit it.
Yeah. And I got to say, I was relieved, because when we released the episode, I'm thinking, okay, how long until somebody brings this to David's attention that we talked about his book, and how long until we hear how dead wrong we were about everything and how dare you? No, it wasn't like that at all.
No.
He reached out to us and said, hey, I'll be happy to be on your podcast. Yeah. It's like, cool.
Yeah, he's extremely gracious. And,
yeah, thank you.
And just from what we've seen, I mean, we're not the only podcasters and fans that he has gotten in touch with. There have been many other podcast episodes that he's appeared on, and he's graciously given his time to talk to a lot of people in the community. And that's an awesome thing.
Yeah. And hopefully we'll have him again sometime. But should we call it a day?
Yeah.
It is a day.
Actually, call it a night, because it's...
Well, night is part of the day.
Well, yeah.
But then again, the day destroys the night.
Remember the day. Remember the night.
All day long?
Yep, exactly.
I'm going to whistle out. No, I can't whistle right now. Too dry. Anyway, it's Sean.
And Lisa.
And you see, another problem is we came up with a topic for next episode, and the problem when you do that is plans change. Oops, we didn't talk about 1965. We talked about David Leaf.
Oh, we will get to that.
We'll get to that. Maybe next time, maybe not.
That reminds me, I need to read that book.
Well, read that book. Anyway, talk to you next time.
Just so you know what I'm talking about, there's a whole book that I picked up a couple of years ago and just never read it yet, about 1965. I think primarily about the music of that year, but also other events and pop culture and things like that. So I figure this is a good time to get around to reading that book. Because it might provide valuable insights. Since neither of us were around in 1965.
Nope.
So we can only speak of it from a historical perspective.
Yeah.
And I know there are people who are probably throwing things at their speakers right now that were referring to 1965 as historical. I'm sorry. If it helps, there's a colleague of mine at work who just mentioned that she was born the year I graduated high school. So I feel it.
Lovely.
I feel it too.
Huh. I don't. But anyway. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll talk to you again in another time.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Tune X podcast. Please leave us a review at Apple Podcasts or iTunes.
You can hear us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Amazon, Google Podcasts, and just about every other provider out there. If TuneX isn't on your favorite provider, please let us know.
You can email us at tunexpodcast@gmail.com. Our website, which includes the show notes, is tunex.fab4it.com. Fab4it is spelled F-A-B, then the number 4, then I-T.
Feel free to connect with us on social media. TuneX is on Facebook, and we're also on Instagram and Twitter, both under the handle of TuneX Podcast.
Our opening and closing theme, Melody 10, was written and performed by Scattered Frog. All other music and sounds used in this episode remain the properties of their respective copyright holders and are used for the purposes of commentary and review. No infringement is intended.
We'll see you next time, friends. Until then, don't back down from that wave.
I mean, it's car, hotel, car, sound check, car, hotel, car, airport. I mean, there's not a lot to say.
You sound like Paul's grandfather in A Hard Day's Night. In a car, in a room, in a room, in a room.
If I thought of it, I would have been happy to use that.